Welcome back to Hardball. Opponents of voter ID laws are hoping that yesterday's big win in Wisconsin has opened the door for similar victories in other states. Here's the background. A federal judge ruled yesterday that Wisconsin's law requiring a government-issued photo ID to vote is unconstitutional because it places an undue burden on poor and minority voters, something we've been saying here a long time. And this big win follows pro-voting rights rulings in Pennsylvania, where a state judge reaffirmed a ruling that the state's voter ID law there is also unconstitutional. And down in Arkansas, where a judge struck down the state's voter ID law, saying it violates the state's constitution. At least 32 states have passed laws requiring voters to show some form of identification at the polls, and 16 states have laws in effect similar to the one just struck down in Wisconsin, requiring a photo ID. Voter ID opponents in these states could use the Wisconsin case now, starting today, as a roadmap to ensure the right to vote is protected, their right. It's a roadmap that uses Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the part that remains after the Supreme Court's evisceration of the act by removing Section 5 last year. It proves these ID requirements are an unduly burden on poor minorities. Again, what we've been saying here. Dale Ho is director of the ACLU Voting Rights Project. Judith Brown-Dianis is co-director of the Advancement Project. Both these groups represented plaintiffs in the Wisconsin case. By the way, this excerpt from the federal judge's decision shows how Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was applied. Quote, Section 2 protects against a voting practice that creates a barrier to voting that is more likely to appear in the path of a voter if that voter is a member of a minority group than if he or she is not. The presence of a barrier that has this kind of disproportionate impact prevents the political process from being equally open to all and results in members of the minority group having less opportunity to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of their choice. Judith, thank you for joining us again. I'll get to Dale in a second. Are you happy that we now have some evidence that the federal judges are willing to say our Constitution protects us from these undue burdens of having to vote?
Well, I think what's really important about this case, this is a huge win for Wisconsin, for voters, but also for the Voting Rights Act, because, in fact, we see that while the Supreme Court took a dagger to the heart of the Voting Rights Act, that, in fact, the other part of the Voting Rights Act is alive and well, and that it can be used in cases like on voter ID, for example, to show that, in fact, there's a disproportionate impact on voters of color. And so this is a huge win. The ACLU and Advancement Project were counsel in this case. And I think now what we're going to be able to do is to use this decision. In fact, next week, Advancement Project has a brief due in our case in North Carolina, and we'll be able to rely on this decision.
You hopeful?
I'm very hopeful. I think that this judge set out the roadmap for other courts, and he actually said that, in fact, if they went back and tried to alter that law in Wisconsin, he can't imagine a situation in which, in fact, they could get around the Voting Rights Act.
Do you agree with that, Dale? Are you hopeful or optimistic that now there's a pattern of judicial decision-making, a precedent here that the federal government, in protecting constitutional rights, will say people have a right to vote? And you can't use extraordinary means to demand that they show things that they may not have in their possession, like a driver's license.
We're really optimistic, Chris. There are pending voter ID challenges in other federal courts right now in Texas and North Carolina, as Judith mentioned. And this decision, I think, really buoys our hopes that the courts will really understand what kind of effect these laws have. What was so great about the court's opinion in this case, Chris, was that he said that you can't, as a state, just make, unsupported assertions that there's fraud going on or that this is important for public confidence, that if you're going to make it harder for people to vote, and there are hundreds of thousands of people in Wisconsin, registered voters, who don't have one of these forms of ID, if you're going to do that, you need to present actual evidence that this kind of fraud that you claim to be preventing is actually happening. And what was amazing was that the state of Wisconsin couldn't identify a single case of fraud that this voter ID law would have prevented, and the judge called them out on that.
Is this, can you say in your position that this has been partisan, that this effort to come up with new ways of new requirements was a Republican effort to deal with the demographic time bomb they faced, that there are going to be fewer white people?
Definitely. I mean, this is about the demographic shift and their desire to continue to hold control in these state legislatures. Even when you look at a state like North Carolina, you know, what happened in North Carolina, it wasn't until they actually were able to get a Republican governor that they were able to shove through not only a voter ID law that's restrictive, but also kind of a monster bill of voter suppression.
Okay. Let's accept the argument, which I do from both of you. It seems to me that there's no rampant corruption out there. There's no rampant fraud. But to the person watching right now that wants to know, how do we avoid? Are there any ways? What do you think that should be the standard when you go to vote? Suppose you're working behind a desk, you're a volunteer, and somebody comes in you don't recognize. You're not from the neighborhood. You're not kidding. You're kidding me. You're not from around here. I've never seen you. Okay. How do they deal with that?
So I think one of the things that we should know is that federal law, the Help America Vote Act, actually already has a set of IDs in it that you can use, and you use it for your first time voting. So your phone bill, as long as we know who you are, you come in and you prove that that's who you are, and this is your address, that's enough. What we don't have is...
You believe it's enough?
Yes, I believe that's enough. We don't have in-person voter ID. You know, the President's Election Commission, actually, which was Ben Ginsburg, showed there was no fraud.
Okay, we'll talk about this a lot because I care about it. I think everybody should vote. Thank you, Dale Ho. Thank you, Judith Brown Dianis. We'll be right back after this.